HOA tried to turn my dock into their political stage. The morning they barged into my kitchen and hung up on a county commissioner, I knew the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. They demanded my Lakeside lodge, my dock, my land, never knowing I'm the guy who wrote half the rules they were trying to break. Stick around, because what they tried next blew open a scandal 3 counties wide. And if you love seeing HOA bullies get humbled by the law, go on and subscribe. I've got plenty more coming. The morning had started the way most good ones do on Loon Feather Lake, quiet enough to hear the wind brushing through the pines, steady enough to smell the cold mineral breath rolling off the water. I stood by the long counter of my kitchen, one hand resting on the smooth, worn cedar, the other holding my phone on speaker as Commissioner Ruth Hale's voice crackled through the line. The old lodge creaked the way it always had, like it was stretching awake after the night. "Elias," Ruth said, "I need your input on these watershed clauses before I finalize the public release. If we don't frame the federal coordination correctly, that language needs to be simple," I said. "If residents don't understand it, they'll assume the county's overreaching. Use the highlight about maintaining natural shoreline. It's the most relatable." My words died in my throat when the kitchen door slammed open so hard the hinges squealed. I turned, and there she was. Marjorie Klein, HOA president of Lakeside Estates, marched into my kitchen like a bright fuchsia avalanche, wearing too much perfume and too much confidence. Behind her lumbered her husband, Sterling, dressed in a pressed gray suit that had never seen a Montana winter, let alone a gravel driveway. Their entrance felt like a branch snapping across still water, loud, wrong, violating. Neither of them knocked. Neither apologized. They just stood there, breathing up my kitchen's warm lodge air like they owned the place. "Elias?" Ruth's voice called through the speaker. "What was that noise?" Before I could answer, Marjorie reached across my counter and hung up my call with the commissioner, her acrylic nail clicking against the screen with the smug finality of a judge's gavel. My breath caught. Not in fear. In fury. The audacity of that single motion rolled through my ribs like thunder. "Good," Marjorie said, straightening. "We need your full attention." I stared at her hand, still hovering above my phone as if she hadn't just ended a government call from inside my own home. Sterling gave the place a slow once-over. Cedar beams, stone fireplace, panoramic windows facing the lake, as if appraising what it'd be worth chopped up and resold. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though heat clawed its way up my spine. "We're here on official HOA business," Marjorie replied, smoothing her jacket as if a wrinkle offended her more than trespassing. "Your lodge has been selected to serve as the new Community Event Operations Center." Sterling spoke up, tone slick as wet stone. "It's for the greater good, Elias. Lakeside Estates needs a proper venue for high-value gatherings. Your property has potential." I stepped forward slowly, like approaching a wild animal you're not sure is rabid or just stupid. "You walked into my kitchen. You hung up on an active call with the county commissioner. And now you're telling me my home is being, what, repurposed?" Marjorie lifted a leather folio stuffed with official-looking papers. "The HOA board passed an emergency ordinance authorizing community use of underutilized waterfront assets, effective immediately. We're notifying you of your obligations." "Obligations?" I echoed. She nodded. "Yes. Your lodge will host HOA events, political gatherings, and community meetings as needed. You'll have 72 hours to comply with staging requirements. Sterling's already planning the rollout." Sterling smiled like he was rehearsing for a campaign ad. "Think of it as your contribution to the community, Elias." The kitchen window behind them framed the lake, still, glass clear, reflecting the line of snow-capped peaks beyond. I'd spent years restoring this lodge after inheriting it from my great-uncle. 12 acres of untouched shoreline. Timber. I cut myself. A dock built with the same design principles I used in my engineering days. my sanctuary. And these two waltzed in like they were picking paint colors. Marjorie tapped her papers. We'll need access to every room of the lodge. We'll also be assigning parking easements along your driveway. Oh, and you'll temporarily suspend private use of your dock. An ember of anger cracked through me. I'd seen overreach before. On dams, in flood hearings, in land disputes, where greed outweighed sense. But never this bold, never this stupid. I took one slow breath, grounding myself in the cedar scent of the lodge, the faint ripple of lake air sound drifting in through the slightly cracked window. Then I asked the only question that fit the moment, the question that tightened Sterling's jaw and froze Marjorie's smile like water turning to ice. Tell me, I said, voice low and even, who exactly gave you the right to walk into my home? For a heartbeat, neither of them answered. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old tin clock above my pantry and the winter wind brushing against the lodge's wooden siding. Marjorie's painted smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough to show she hadn't expected pushback. Sterling's eyes narrowed like he was recalculating the situation, measuring how much resistance I might offer. Marjorie recovered first. She lifted her chin, the bright fuchsia jacket catching the morning light. The authority, she said crisply, comes directly from the Lakeside Estates HOA board. As president, I am empowered to, No, I cut in just as steady. That's not what I asked. Sterling stepped forward, the soles of his Italian shoes clicking unnaturally against my hand-scraped wooden floors. Elias, we're trying to be reasonable. The board passed an emergency ordinance. All we're doing is enforcing it, nothing more. He spoke like a real estate broker pretending he wasn't closing in on his next acquisition. It's legal, it's binding, and frankly, it's overdue. My jaw tightened as Marjorie unsnapped her leather folio and slid out a stack of documents thick enough to choke a paper shredder. She spread them across my kitchen table. My table, smoothed by decades of use, the same one I'd refinished by hand when I took over the lodge. Now it was buried under stamped pages, blue-backed sheets, and a red tab that screamed urgent ordinance approval. This, she said, tapping the top document with a manicured nail, is the Emergency Community Access Ordinance, passed unanimously last week. I leaned over the stack, scanning the first section. The paper had the right seals, the right font, even the right legal phrasing. But it was too perfect, too polished. And the language, phrases about shoreline utility assessment, emergency communal staging needs, and underutilized waterfront resources, was pulled almost word for word from the watershed guidelines I'd helped draft years ago for the State Environmental Committee. Only someone with access to those internal notes could have written this. Sterling folded his arms smugly as he watched me read. As you can see, your property meets all necessary criteria for temporary community commandeering during periods of organizational need. I lifted the top page. Something didn't sit right. The signatures at the bottom, a jumble of names from board members I'd met once or twice in passing, were too uniform. Same pen pressure, same slant, same ink density. Forged. Marjorie, mistaking my silence for submission, continued. Per Section 4B, you will be required to open your lodge for community events with 48 hours notice. Section 6A allows for temporary reassignment of dock rights. And Section 7 permits us to conduct an immediate inspection of all interior rooms to ensure suitability for high-value gatherings. The wind pushed against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames. Somewhere out on the lake, a loon called. Long, low, mournful. The kind of sound that made you feel the weight of old timber and older secrets. Sterling placed both hands on the table, leaning in so close I could smell the cologne he probably applied by the handful. Listen, Elias. These ordinances are designed to elevate the community. This lodge, your lodge, is sitting on 12 acres of prime shoreline. It's wasted on one man." He said wasted like an insult. I exhaled slowly through my nose, grounding myself in the lodge's familiar scents: cedar, pine sap, faint smoke from last night's fire. "Funny," I said, sliding the signature page closer to me. "This ordinance required public notice, and yet I don't recall receiving anything. No email, no mailing, no posted sign." Marjorie's smile froze. "It was expedited." "Uh-huh," I murmured. "And the signatures? They look oddly consistent." Her eyes flicked downward, barely, but enough. Sterling clapped a hand on the table. "This is pointless. The ordinance is valid. The board is unanimous. You can either cooperate or face a non-compliance notice, and trust me, those accumulate fast." Anger curled in my chest, slow and hot. I kept my voice level. "You're telling me the HOA can repurpose privately owned land, without due process, without proper notice, using an emergency order written with language from state environmental regulations?" Marjorie stiffened. "Where do you think we got that language?" My head lifted. "That's exactly what I'd like to know." A gust of wind pushed a thin layer of snowflakes against the kitchen window, casting a shifting reflection of all three of us over the lake behind it. Two intruders, one owner, and a lodge caught in the middle of something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. Marjorie tapped the documents again, impatience bleeding through her voice. "Sign the compliance acknowledgement, Elias. Let's not drag this out." Something in me snapped. Not loudly, not outwardly, but deep inside where instinct meets memory. I'd spent years on dam sites where one bad decision could sink a valley. I'd watched land surveys turn into legal battles. I'd seen greed take many shapes. But this was calculated, coordinated, sloppy on the surface but dangerous underneath. I slid the papers back toward her with a single finger. "Marjorie," I said quietly, "where did you get this ordinance?" The question landed like a hammer on ice. The room seemed to shrink around us. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I leaned in, voice calm but cold as the lake outside. "Tell me exactly who handed you this document, because it sure as hell didn't come from the HOA alone." She swallowed, and for the first time that morning, I saw her confidence fracture. The crack didn't last long. Marjorie's expression snapped back into its lacquered composure, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ordinance like it might save her if she held onto it hard enough. Sterling stepped forward as if to shield her from her own slip, his posture stiffening as he pulled back the slick politician's smile. "We don't need to explain administrative procedure to you," he said. "The vote was held. The ordinance passed. Your compliance is mandatory." It was the first sign of panic I'd heard in his voice. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the lake, sending ripples against the old wooden dock. The sound echoed through the kitchen window, gentle, rhythmic, the kind of noise I'd grown used to hearing every morning. It grounded me while the two intruders tried to pull me into a storm of their own making. I straightened. "Our conversation is over. Get out." Marjorie blinked like no one had given her a direct order in her adult life. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." I pointed at the door. "You're trespassing. Our business is finished." Sterling bristled, but he must have seen something in my face he didn't like. He gathered the papers, stuffing them back into Marjorie's folio with movements sharper than before. "This isn't the end of it," he hissed, voice low enough that even Marjorie didn't seem to catch all of it. "You can't stonewall the HOA, Elias. You can't stonewall us." I didn't answer. They slammed the kitchen door behind them, leaving the cold Montana air swirling in their wake. When it shut, the lodge seemed to exhale with me, the old rafters groaning as if relieved to have their weight gone. But the relief didn't last. Within hours, the retaliation began. It started with a yellow tag on my front gate, flapping in the afternoon wind, tied to the iron latch with cheap twine. A notice of property non-compliance stamped in bold red letters. The ink bled slightly from the cold, giving it a menacing blur. According to the form, I'd violated 3 codes: unapproved exterior lighting, unauthorized dock extension, failure to maintain community visibility requirements. The problems. I hadn't changed my lighting in years. My dock hadn't been touched since the summer, and visibility requirements wasn't even part of the HOA bylaws. I pulled the tag off and tucked it into my jacket. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Ridge Rock Bank, my bank. They wanted to review recent changes to my account activity. There were no recent changes. Then came the contractors. By late afternoon, 3 separate crews who were scheduled to do basic winter prep, gutter clearing, chimney inspection, snow load reinforcements, had canceled. Each left nearly identical messages. Due to potential legal conflicts, new information from the HOA, unable to proceed until further notice. Their voices carried the same apologetic tone people use when they're afraid to say the real reason. As the day slipped into cold evening, a neighbor's truck pulled into my driveway. The headlights swung across the lodge's pine siding and settled on me as I leaned against the porch rail, watching the fog drift over the lake. The driver stepped out slowly. It was Mark Trellis, a quiet man from a few properties down. He ran a small boat repair shop and kept mostly to himself. Tonight, he looked uneasy, twisting his cap in his hands like he couldn't hold on to the right words. He climbed the porch steps, his boots knocking dust from the old boards. "Elias," he said, voice low. "Saw the HOA folks leaving your place this morning. You doing all right?" "Depends on your definition." I held up the yellow compliance tag. "They're escalating." Mark's jaw tightened. "Yeah, that's how they start." I narrowed my eyes. "You sound like you've seen this before." A heavy silence settled between us. The lake lapped against the shore, soft, steady, like it was trying to push us toward the truth. Finally, Mark sighed and reached into the back seat of his truck, pulling out a folder so worn the edges had curled. He held it out like it was something radioactive. "You need to see what they did to the last family who resisted." A chill, not related to the temperature, slid down my spine. "What family?" I asked. "The Bryersons," he said. "They lived on the far cove past the ridge. Had a small cabin, nothing fancy, but good folks. HOA targeted them last spring. Ordinances, fines, property violations out of thin air. Then, other stuff. Pressure, harassment. They ended up selling the place for half of what it was worth." I opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, warning letters, violation tags eerily similar to the one I'd pulled from my gate, and a blurry photo of a sign posted on the Bryersons' dock. "Unsafe structure. Closed pending inspection." But the dock didn't look unsafe. It looked sabotaged. Mark lowered his voice. "Kleins were behind every step of it. They got the property, sold it to a development company 2 months later." The wind picked up, rustling the pines around us. The sky had turned a heavy slate color, mirroring the lake swallowing the last streaks of daylight. I felt the weight of Mark's words press into the cold air. "What happened to the Bryersons after they sold?" I asked. "They left," Mark said quietly. "Moved out of state. Told me it wasn't worth the fight." He paused. "But you're not them, are you, Elias?" I shook my head slowly. No, I'm not." Mark put a hand on my shoulder, a rare show of solidarity from a man who usually kept to himself. "Just be careful. Folks around here are scared of the HOA, but the Kleins, they're something else." He stepped off the porch and walked back toward his truck. The engine rumbled to life, the headlights cutting through the fog as he backed down my driveway. Before he closed the door, he called out through the open window, If they're coming after you, it's 'cause they think you can't fight 'em. Prove 'em wrong." His taillights disappeared into the dark. I stood there alone, the cold biting at my skin, the folder heavy in my hands. The lake was quiet, too quiet. But the pressure wasn't quiet at all. It was building, like water behind a dam, and I knew better than anyone. Dams only hold so long. By morning, the pressure had settled into the lodge like a cold draft. I barely slept, kept awake by the steady lap of lake water under the dock and the soft groaning of timber beams warming with the sunrise. A thin frost clung to the grass outside, each blade glittering in the dawn light like tiny shards of glass. The lake looked almost metallic, flat, reflective, hiding depth beneath its calm surface. I brewed coffee the way my uncle taught me, percolator on low heat, slow pour, nothing rushed. The smell filled the kitchen, a welcome contrast to the bitter memory of the Kleins barging in the previous day. I stood there, mug warming my hands, staring out at the water, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A boxy old Suburban rolled up the hill, paint faded, bumper covered in stickers from national parks. The engine cut off with a shudder. After a moment, the driver's side door opened, and Dr. Sylvie Hartland stepped out, bundled in a thick wool coat, her silver hair pulled back in a low, practical ponytail. She wasn't HOA. She wasn't trouble. But she carried a look that told me she hadn't come for coffee. "Morning, Elias," she called, her breath visible in the cold air. "Morning, Doc," I answered, stepping onto the porch. She didn't bother with small talk. Instead, she popped open the Suburban's rear hatch and lifted out a banker's box, the cardboard frayed at the edges, like it had been opened and closed too many times. She held it with both hands, heavy enough to require effort. A gust of wind swept across the ridge, bending the pine branches overhead. Something about the way Sylvie protected the box from the cold made my stomach tighten. "Can we talk inside?" she asked. I nodded and led her in. The lodge welcomed her with the warm smell of coffee and the soft creak of old floorboards. She set the box on the kitchen table, right where Marjorie had spread her forged ordnance just 24 hours earlier. Sylvie took a slow breath. "I heard they paid you a visit. That obvious?" "Half the neighborhood heard Marjorie's voice from the road," she said dryly. "The woman projects like a church bell." I sat across from her. "What's in the box?" She removed the lid. Inside lay a stack of documents, binders, photographs, printed emails, handwritten notes on yellow legal pads. Some pages were clipped together with rusted binder clips. Others were stuffed into clear sleeves, corners bent from use. "This," she said, "is 3 years of HOA corruption." The wind outside rattled the window pane, as if the lodge itself inhaled sharply at her words. I leaned in. She began sorting through papers with the precise movements of a scientist. Careful, methodical, steady. "I didn't want to get involved at first," she admitted. "I moved here to retire, study the lake, enjoy the quiet. But last spring, when the Bryersons were forced to sell, something didn't sit right with me." She slid a photograph across the table. The Bryersons' cabin, the one Mark had mentioned, sat nestled beside the far cove. Except the image showed construction crews tearing out mature shoreline trees, the kind that took decades to grow. Fresh soil was exposed, dotted with heavy equipment tracks. My chest tightened. "That land was supposed to be protected under shoreline conservation," I said. "It was," she replied, "until the HOA labeled it a community hazard." She pushed forward another photo, a close-up of a laminated tag posted on the Bryersons' door. "Mandatory eviction review, non-compliant structure." "They forged environmental violations," she said. "Cited runoff issues that don't exist. Used emergency authority to push them out." I sifted through more files. Emails exchanged between Sterling and a development firm called Klein Heritage Development. HOA meeting notes without timestamps. Aerial images of docks dismantled without owner consent. Invoices for staging equipment charged to homeowners who never hosted events. Sylvie tapped a folder near the bottom of the stack. And then there are the ordinance drafts. Multiple versions. All written in the same hand. I opened the folder. There they were. Rough drafts of the very ordinance Marjorie dropped on my table. Same phrasing. Same structure. Only earlier versions had comments in the margin. Needs stronger justification. Rewrite Section 4B. Remove mention of federal waterway restrictions. Make this mandatory for lakefront only. You're kidding me, I whispered. They targeted only lakefront properties. Yes, she said. Water access is the real prize. Privacy, value, control. Her last word hit harder than the others. Sylvie reached into the bottom of the box and removed one more item, a thin manila envelope. She opened it carefully and slid out a printout. Elias, this is why I came to you. I read the heading. Property Target List. Phase 3. Status, pending execution. My name was third on the sheet. My parcel number, my acreage, my dock measurements, and next to it scribbled in red ink, owner resistant, requires accelerated action. The room felt colder, though the floor heating hummed quietly under the cedar planks. How long have you had this? I asked. 2 weeks. Her voice lowered. I didn't know how to bring it to you, or if I should. But after what happened yesterday, you need to see the full scope. I rubbed a hand over my jaw, feeling the familiar stubble scrape my palm. The realization hit slow, like molasses dripping down a slope. The ordinance wasn't sloppy. It wasn't rushed. It was strategic, purposed, tested on others before me. And now it was my turn. Sylvie watched my reaction carefully. Elias, I think this operation is larger than an HOA. I think the Kleins are working with someone outside the community. Somebody with legal reach, political connections, and a vested interest in acquiring lakefront properties. I exhaled, the breath heavy. You think they're flipping properties to a developer? I think they are the developer, she said. Or at least they're funneling things to one. The frost outside began melting as the sun rose higher, sending faint drip sounds along the gutters. Somewhere in the pines, a single hawk cried out. Inside, everything felt still, too still. I closed the folder slowly. So my lodge isn't just some new target. It's the next step in a pattern. Sylvie nodded. And if you don't act fast, they'll close in before you have a chance to stop them. I leaned back, the old chair creaking under my weight. Doc, I said quietly, why bring all this to me? She looked me dead in the eyes. Because the Kleins messed with the wrong man, and because someone finally needs to fight back. Her words settled in the air, heavy as silt. I stood, walked to the window overlooking the lake, and watched the early sun stretch across the water like a ribbon of fire. The lodge was quiet, the lake peaceful, but below that calm surface, currents were shifting. Sylvie's voice came from behind me. Elias, what are you going to do? I didn't turn around. Prepare. Prepare for what? For whatever they try next. The wind picked up, brushing against the window frame, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and cold lake water. The kind of smell that always warned me a storm was on its way. And storms, once they start, don't stop until they've ripped through everything in their path. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, clouds stacked low over the mountains like wet wool blankets. I woke early, uneasy, the kind of restless feeling I used to get on dam sites before a major safety audit, something in the air humming wrong. The lodge was quiet, except for the ticking of the stove cooling from the night's fire. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. I had just poured myself a mug of coffee when I heard it. The crunch of multiple tires on my gravel drive. Not one vehicle. Not two. A convoy. I stepped onto the porch. 3 vehicles rolled to a stop. A black SUV with HOA plates. A county inspector's truck. And a tan sedan with tinted windows, too clean for the dirt roads around here. The SUV door opened first. Marjorie Klein emerged in a new fuchsia blazer, hair pinned so tight it looked painful. She held a clipboard like a weapon. Sterling climbed out behind her, wearing confidence he hadn't earned, and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The county inspector stepped out of the second truck, mid-50s, nervous, clutching a binder against his chest. He avoided eye contact with me. That was telling. Then a man stepped out of the tan sedan, adjusting his coat with the bored precision of someone who spent more time in courtrooms than on dirt roads. He held a document envelope stamped with a county seal. Marjorie approached my porch like she owned the ground beneath her shoes. "Mr. Crowley," she announced loudly, "we're here for the mandatory inspection required under the Emergency Community Access Ordinance. Please unlock all entrances to the lodge." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the heat steady me. "No." The inspector blinked. Sterling scoffed. Marjorie's face reddened in a way that clashed impressively with her jacket. "You don't have a choice," she snapped. "This inspection is legally authorized." "Show me," I said. The man from the sedan stepped forward and handed me a sealed envelope. "Court order," he said, as if reciting a line he'd practiced. "Signed last night by Judge Brenton Cross, authorizing immediate inspection of the premises for compliance with HOA emergency mandates." I broke the seal and scanned the first page. It looked official, signatures, seals, legal jargon, but something didn't line up. The ordinance references were dated weeks before the emergency session, and the inspection justification cited environmental concerns that didn't exist on my property. Not to mention Judge Cross's signature was too neat, too perfect, like it had been lifted from a template. "You get a judge to sign this at 9 o'clock at night?" I asked. "The judge understands the urgency," Sterling said smoothly. I raised an eyebrow. "Or he understands something else." The inspector shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. Marjorie lifted her chin. "Let's not delay. Open the door." I didn't move. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen. Ruth Hale's contact lit up immediately. I hit speaker. The call connected after one ring. "Elias? Everything all right?" Ruth asked. I held the phone out toward the group. "Commissioner, we have some company." Marjorie stiffened. Sterling's smirk faltered. Ruth's tone sharpened. "Who?" "Marjorie and Sterling," I said. "And they've brought a county inspector and a court order for an immediate property inspection." The line went silent for a moment. Then Ruth spoke, her voice hard enough to freeze the lake. "Mr. Crowley, no HOA inspection is authorized at this time. None. And any court order issued without county review is invalid pending verification." Marjorie stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Commissioner Hale, you're overstepping." "No," Ruth cut in. "You are. And I'm instructing the inspector right now. Stop all HOA-initiated actions until further notice." The inspector cleared his throat weakly. "Ma'am, Yes, ma'am." Sterling yanked the envelope from my hand and shoved it at the inspector. "We have legal authority." "Not anymore," Ruth said sharply. "And if any of you continue this stunt, there will be consequences at the county level." I watched the confidence melt off Sterling's face like ice under a blowtorch. Marjorie, however, wasn't done. "This isn't over," she hissed. "We have rights. The HOA has rights." Ruth's voice answered before I could. "I'll be reviewing your emergency ordinance myself. If I find even one irregularity, your board will be suspended pending investigation." The inspector stepped back, shaking his head. I'm sorry, folks. I can't proceed. Silence settled over the group, the kind of silence that feels like a dropped gavel. Ruth ended the call with one final sentence. Hang tight, Elias, and document everything. The line clicked off. Marjorie's eyes burned with fury, but the fight had drained from her posture. Sterling tugged on her arm, trying to salvage what pride remained. We'll be back, Marjorie spat. Not without proper authority, I replied calmly. Their convoy backed down the drive, tires spitting gravel. The inspector was the last to leave. He gave me a small, apologetic nod before rolling away. I stood there on the porch, coffee cooling in my mug, dew collecting on the wooden rail, pine needles shaking in the rising wind. For the moment, the storm had passed. But storms never end with the first strike. And something told me the Kleins weren't retreating. They were regrouping. The convoy's taillights had barely disappeared around the bend when the lodge settled into a strange, brittle quiet, like the air after a lightning strike but before the thunder reaches you. I stood there on the porch, letting the cold drift across my skin while the lake murmured softly below. A gray morning light pushed through the trees, flattening the colors of the shoreline until they looked like old photographs. I finished my coffee in silence, then went inside to grab a notepad. If Ruth wanted documentation, she'd get it. I'd worked too many dam audits and compliance reviews to take sloppy notes. Every name, time, and detail went down. Marjorie's tone, Sterling's legal envelope, the inspector's hesitation, the seal on the supposed court order, even the model of the sedan. Facts mattered. Facts saved people. Facts built cases that couldn't be shaken by intimidation or theatrics. By noon, the wind had shifted sharply, blowing colder from the north. Clouds stacked over the western ridge, casting long shadows across the lake. I was writing at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed again. Commissioner Ruth Hale. I answered immediately. Elias, she said without preamble, I've reviewed the ordinance draft Marjorie submitted last night. It's invalid. I leaned back slowly. How bad is it? Bad enough to get someone disbarred if they were foolish enough to draft it, she said. It violates state notice requirements, bypasses environmental review, and contains language lifted directly from restricted planning documents. Someone fed them this. Someone with access. A cold knot tightened at the base of my spine. Exactly the suspicion Sylvie had raised. Can you halt all HOA enforcement? I asked. Already done, she replied. I've also notified the county legal team. They're starting an internal review. If the Kleins try anything else, record it. We're building a file. I exhaled slowly. They'll try something. You know that. Ruth's voice softened. I do. But you're not standing alone in this, Elias. Stand firm. We'll handle the legal side. The call ended with her assuring me she'd be in touch within 24 hours. I set the phone down and stared at the kitchen wall for a long moment, listening to the stove hum and the lake water tapping softly against the pilings. The lodge had always been a place of peace, thick logs soaked with history, window glass rippling faintly with age, the smell of smoke and pine needles embedded in every corner. But now it felt like the front line of a conflict I hadn't asked for. A knock at the door broke the quiet. I opened it to find Sheriff Wyatt Moreno standing on the porch. A big man with a quiet stride, Wyatt carried himself like someone used to breaking up bar fights and bad news without raising his voice. His cruiser idled at the base of the hill, headlights dimmed in the gray afternoon. Morning, Elias, he said, adjusting his hat. Sheriff, let me guess. You heard? Whole county heard, he muttered. Word travels when the HOA tries to bulldoze a man's house before breakfast. He stepped inside, removing his hat and brushing a bit of frost from the brim. I poured him a cup of coffee without asking. We'd known each other long enough. Wyatt leaned against the counter, cup warming his hands. You all right? For now, I said. But they're not stopping. You can feel it. He nodded. Yeah. Folks like the Kleins don't like being told no. They especially don't like being embarrassed. He reached into his jacket and handed me a printout. A complaint file. Came across this morning. It's from 3 months ago. Family out near Pine Hollow reported harassment and forced inspection attempts. Guess who signed the inspection requests? I scanned it. Marjorie. Sterling. 2 other HOA board members I barely recognized. Same pattern, Wyatt said. Same urgency, same language, and all targeting lakefront parcels. I set the paper down. Sylvie told me the same thing. Wyatt lifted a brow. Doc Hartland? She's good people. Sharp as a tack. If she's involved, things must be serious. They are. We stood there for a moment, the hum of the heater the only sound between us. Wyatt took a slow sip of coffee. Look, Elias. You've always kept to yourself. Folks respect that. But this is different. HOA's pushing something bigger than community rules. They're looking for leverage, land, influence. Control, I added. Yeah, he murmured. That too. He set the cup down gently. I'm telling you this as a friend. Stay alert. Document every move they make. They're screwing around with legal processes they don't understand. That's dangerous, for them and everyone caught in their wake. He headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. And Elias? Don't let him scare you. Folks around here may be quiet, but they aren't blind. A lot of people are watching this. The door shut softly behind him, leaving the lodge in its familiar hush. I spent the rest of the afternoon compiling more notes, copying files from Sylvie's box, photographing the forged ordinance pages, outlining a timeline of HOA actions. Outside, the wind picked up, driving small ripples across the lake. A twig scratched along the siding. Somewhere down the drive, a raven cawed, its voice bouncing through the pines like a warning. Near dusk, just as the sky took on that bruised purple color over the mountains, my phone buzzed again. A text from Ruth Hale. Prepare yourself. They're not backing off, and they know now you're pushing back. I stared at the screen, jaw tight, pulse steady. The Kleins weren't done. They were circling for another strike. And this time, they wouldn't come with forged paperwork or thin threats. They'd come louder, faster, more desperate. But as the shadows thickened across the lake and the last light faded from the water, I felt something shift inside me. Slow, heavy, inevitable. I wasn't backing down either. Night settled over Loon Feather Lake like a wool blanket. Thick, insulating, muffling sound in a way that made you hear your own heartbeat. I stood on the back deck long after Wyatt drove off, listening to the lodge creak as the temperature dropped. Snow threatened in the air, the kind that arrives quiet and heavy before you even notice the first flake. The lake was so still it looked like obsidian, and in that reflection, I saw something I hadn't acknowledged in years. I was done being passive. I went inside, lit the lamp on my desk, and pulled out a cedar box tucked beneath a stack of old survey maps. I hadn't opened it since moving into the lodge. The hinges squeaked softly as I lifted the lid. Inside were documents, my old planning credentials, environmental compliance authorizations, access ID badges from a dozen state projects, and the one card I'd hoped I'd never have to use again. County Strategic Policy Advisor, Tier 2. Access Office of Commissioner Ruth Hale. I'd earned that position after 20 years of engineering, drafting, and mediating some of the most contentious land use disputes in the region. I stepped away last year to restore the lodge, thinking I'd left the bureaucratic battles behind. But some fights don't wait for you to volunteer. They come knocking, sometimes barging, into your kitchen wearing a fuchsia blazer. My phone buzzed. A text from Sylvie. They won't stop, Elias. Not until you force them to. Ready when you are. Another from Wyatt. If they try anything tonight, call me. I'll be nearby. And then one from Ruth. Call me as soon as you can. Something new came in. I dialed her immediately. She answered on the first ring. Elias, I'm glad you called. I didn't want to text the details. What's happened? County records show multiple ordinance drafts submitted from the same device, she said. A device registered not to the HOA, not to a board member, but to the municipal planning office. Ice slid down my spine. They have someone inside planning? Yes, she said quietly. Someone with access to protected draft models, parcel risk classifications, and shoreline exceptions. That's how they wrote the ordinance, I murmured. They copied restricted content. And targeted you, she added, and others. We traced revisions. Your parcel was highlighted twice last month. I gripped the phone tighter. You said earlier you were initiating an internal review. I am, Ruth replied. But Elias, this runs deeper than we thought. This is political. The Kleins aren't just abusing HOA authority. They're running a coordinated acquisition scheme. Exactly what Sylvie suspected. Ruth exhaled sharply. I need you to listen now, not as a property owner, but as my former policy advisor. Are you listening in that capacity? I straightened instinctively. I am. We're building a case, but it needs airtight documentation, full chain of events, recorded interactions. You are the connection point between the ordinance, the misuse of planning documents, and the attempted inspection. So what's the role you need me to play? The role you've always been good at, she said. The one where you stay calm while a storm builds around you, and you gather every piece of evidence until there's nowhere left for them to run. I nodded slowly, feeling the old part of me awaken, the part that once mediated multi-million-dollar land conflicts. Understood. Good, she said. Because Sterling just scheduled a press conference. I froze. Where? On your dock, she said. Tomorrow morning. A beat of silence stretched between us. My dock? I repeated. They're planning to announce their community enhancement initiative from your shoreline, she said. They already invited local media. They're framing you as an obstructionist to regional progress. They don't have permission, I said. They don't care, she answered. They think you won't push back. They think you're just a lodge owner. Wind rattled the window panes, a branch scraping along the siding like fingernails on old wood. Ruth, I said, voice steady now. They don't know who they're dealing with. No, she said softly. They don't. They think you left the political world behind. I stared down at the advisor badge in my hand, the metal catching the lamplight like a spark. I never left, I murmured. I just took a step back. Then step forward again, she said. Because tomorrow is when we turn the tide. We hung up. I set the badge on the desk and pulled out a notebook, drawing a new list. Record all activity. Secure the property perimeter. Cross-reference ordinance drafts with county archives. Prepare for the press conference. Contact legal counsel. Coordinate with Ruth and County Environmental Protection Office. The lodge felt different now, less like a refuge and more like command headquarters. The soft glow of lamplight stretched across the cedar walls, pooling in the corners like waiting shadows. Outside, the lake was a pane of black glass under a moonless sky. A soft tapping sounded at the back door. I tensed for a moment, but when I opened it, Sylvie stood there bundled in her coat, holding a thermos and a worried expression. Did you hear? She asked. About the press conference? Yeah. You ready for this? I looked past her toward the lake, imagining the cameras, the Kleins, the forced smiles, the lies. Then I imagined something else. Truth cutting through their performance like sunlight through fog. I'm ready, I said. Sylvie nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Then we'd better prepare, because the Kleins, they're planning a spectacle. So are we, I replied. And ours, she said, will be the one that ends them. We worked late into the night, cross-referencing documents, photographing everything in the banker's box, drafting statements for county review. The heater hummed, casting warmth into the cold night air. The storm clouds outside gathered thicker, swirling over the lake like dark ink. Around midnight, Sylvie paused, hand resting on one particular file. You know, she said softly, they really don't know who you are, Elias. I closed the lid of the box gently. They will tomorrow. And as the wind swept hard against the lodge, rattling the eaves with the promise of a coming storm, I realized something simple but powerful. The Kleins weren't the only ones regrouping. So was I. By dawn, the storm that had hovered all night finally broke, thin flurries drifting down like drifting ash, settling on the pine branches, gathering along the edges of the dock. The lake was still, a perfect sheet of silver beneath a sky the color of old tin. I stood on the back porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the false calm stretch across the water. This was the kind of morning that looked peaceful until you noticed the air pressure. Something was about to break. At 7 a.m., the first news van appeared. Its headlights cut through the fog as it bounced down my gravel drive, tires crunching over frozen earth. A second van followed, then a third. Within minutes, the slope behind my lodge was crawling with media crews, cameras, and tripods, their cold breaths rising in clouds. Technicians stomped their boots to keep warm while scanning the property for vantage points. I didn't stop them. Let them film. Let them document everything. The HOA wanted a stage? I'd give them one. At 7:30, Sylvie arrived with a backpack full of organized files and her professional-grade camera. She nodded toward the unfolding chaos. Quite the turnout. They wanted attention, I said. They're about to get more than they can handle. A horn honked sharply. The Kleins' convoy rolled up in polished formation, Marjorie's glossy black Bentley leading the way, flanked by Sterling's silver SUV and a rental van full of folding chairs and staging equipment. They parked in front of my lodge like I'd invited them. Marjorie stepped out first. She wore another fuchsia jacket, this one brighter, louder, as if she were banking on color to distract from her crumbling authority. Sterling emerged behind her dressed in a charcoal overcoat, adjusting his tie with the swagger of a man who'd rehearsed his lines and expected applause. They didn't notice me right away. Marjorie barked orders like a general on campaign day. Stage the podium here. No, further right. I want the lake directly behind Sterling. Make sure the media gets a clear view of the waterline. Sterling checked his reflection in the side of the SUV door, running a hand over his hair. Sylvie leaned close and whispered, They actually think this is going to go well. Of course they do, I murmured. They think the lake is theirs, my dock, my property, my shoreline. They just forgot one thing. What's that? I sipped the coffee, the heat warming my chest. The county isn't behind them, and today that becomes very public. By 8:15, a small audience had gathered, neighbors in winter coats, curious residents, a few HOA loyalists pretending they weren't nervous. The fog lifted enough to reveal the snow-dusted ridge beyond the lake, giving everything a cinematic backdrop, the kind of scene that made downfall look poetic. Finally, Sterling spotted me standing on the porch. He hesitated. For just a second. Then he plastered on a politician's smile and approached. Elias, he said warmly, an actor greeting a fellow cast member. Glad you're here. We're about to present our vision for the community, an initiative that will benefit every resident on this lake. I nodded slowly. On my dock? He laughed, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. This property is a centerpiece of our community's future. You'll understand once you hear the speech. I already do, I said quietly. Sterling frowned slightly, just enough to crack the veneer, before turning away to greet a cluster of reporters. At 9 a.m. sharp, he stepped onto my dock. Camera lights flicked on, tripods adjusted, microphones raised. The wind pushed a faint ripple across the lake, a subtle shiver against the perfect reflection of the clouds. Sterling took his place behind the portable podium, his posture grand and theatrical. Behind him, the lake glowed pale blue. "Good morning," he boomed. "Thank you for joining us to witness the beginning of a new chapter for Loon Feather Lake." I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch railing as Sylvie documented everything. "Our community," Sterling continued, "has suffered from stagnation and underutilization of public access resources. This lodge, this beautiful 12-acre shoreline, represents an opportunity for revitalization." The audacity washed over the crowd like a cold wind. A few neighbors exchanged glances. One shook her head. Sterling pressed on, fervor rising. "With the Emergency Community Access Ordinance, legally approved last week, we can transform this area into a thriving hub for events, fundraisers, and gatherings. This is progress, my friends. Economic growth, property value increase, community elevation." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Klein, is it true the property owner did not agree to this?" Sterling laughed lightly. "Miscommunication. Mr. Crowley misunderstands our intentions." Another reporter chimed in. "And is it also true that the county has halted HOA enforcement pending legal review?" This time Sterling stumbled. Before he could recover, a murmur moved through the crowd. A cameraman pointed to the road. Heads turned. A new convoy approached. Not media, not HOA. County vehicles. 2 dark blue SUVs with the county seal. A sedan with state environmental tags. And behind them, an electric blue hybrid I recognized instantly. Commissioner Ruth Hale. The reporters swarmed like birds shifting direction. Cameras swung toward the drive. Sterling's face drained of color as Ruth stepped out, bundled in a navy coat, with a stack of documents under her arm. She didn't look at Sterling. She walked straight toward the cluster of reporters. "Good morning," Ruth said calmly. "I'm here to provide official clarification on behalf of the county." Sterling rushed forward. "Commissioner Hale, this is—" She raised a hand. "Mr. Klein, I will speak first." Silence blanketed the lake. Her tone sharpened just enough to slice through the cold air. "The ordinance you referenced is invalid. It was not filed properly. It violated notice requirements, and it utilized language stolen from restricted planning documents." The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in. Sterling froze mid-breath. Ruth continued, voice steady as the lake in summer. "Furthermore, the attempt to seize Mr. Crowley's property for HOA use is unlawful. Effective immediately, all HOA enforcement actions related to this lodge are suspended pending investigation." Marjorie's face twisted, hands shaking. "Finally," Ruth said, flipping a document for the cameras, "the county is launching a formal review into potential misuse of municipal resources connected to this ordinance. Any individual involved will be held accountable." The wind picked up again, cold and sharp. Snowflakes drifted across the lake. The silence was heavy enough to feel in the bones. Sterling's voice broke through at last, thin and wavering. This is a misunderstanding. Our initiative is supported by—" Ruth turned to face him fully. "No, Mr. Klein, it is not." Behind her, a state environmental officer stepped forward. "Sir," he said, "we need to ask you a few questions regarding shoreline activity and ordinance drafts linked to your HOA office." Sterling swallowed hard. Marjorie took a step back. The cameras caught every second. On my porch, Sylvie lowered her camera slowly. "This isn't a setback for them," she murmured. "This is collapse." I watched as the wind stirred the lake, sending the first gentle ripples beneath the dock. "They wanted center stage," I said quietly. They're standing on it. And the next act had only just begun. A strange, brittle quiet settled over the lakeshore. One of those silences that doesn't feel peaceful at all, but charged, like the sky before a lightning strike. Reporters whispered to each other, crews adjusted their mics, and neighbors lingered at the edge of the property as if afraid to blink. Even the lake went still, holding the reflection of the ridge as sharply as a blade. Sterling stood frozen on my dock, the wind tugging at the edges of his overcoat. His eyes darted between the cameras, the county officials, and the state officer now approaching him with a folder tucked under one arm. "Mr. Klein," the environmental officer said firmly, "we have documentation indicating unauthorized shoreline alterations linked to your HOA development agenda. We need you to step aside for questioning." Marjorie lunged forward like a mother hen protecting a chick twice her size. "This is outrageous! Sterling is trying to serve this community and you—" Ruth Hale cut her off with a single raised hand. "Mrs. Klein, the evidence speaks for itself." The cameras swiveled toward Ruth as she addressed the crowd with a calm, unwavering voice. "Residents of Loon Feather Lake, I need to be clear. The ordinance the HOA attempted to enforce was fraudulent, illegal, fabricated using restricted county and state materials. Our internal review shows multiple planning references that were never authorized for public release." A rustle of shock swept through the onlookers. Marjorie's face blanched. "Those documents were given to us by—" Sterling seized her wrist. "Don't say a word." But it was already too late. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Klein? Who provided the ordinance material? Was it someone inside planning? Someone supporting your husband's political goals?" Marjorie's lips parted, panic flickering across her features. Sterling hissed under his breath, "Marjorie, stop!" Ruth stepped forward again, flipping open a folder. "We also discovered 3 lakefront properties previously acquired through questionable emergency ordinances. Properties traced directly to Klein Heritage Development, your husband's company. These acquisitions occurred after similar intimidation tactics. The pattern is undeniable." The crowd murmured louder now, anger rising like heat from asphalt. But the real crack, the one that split the Klein's armor clean open, came next. A state environmental investigator stepped up and clicked on a tablet, projecting a map onto a portable screen. The lake, the parcels, and the suspicious transfers. "Mr. Crowley's property," he said, tapping the screen, "was next." Reporters gasped. Neighbors muttered curses beneath their breath. A few shook their heads in disgust. I stayed leaned against the porch railing, watching without speaking. This wasn't my moment. It didn't need to be. I'd done my part. Documentation, patience, pressure. Now the system was catching up. Sterling tried to regain control, lifting his hands as though calming a child's tantrum. "Look, everyone, this is a misunderstanding. Our goal is community growth, property value improvement, shared resources." A reporter cut him off. "Did you forge the ordinance signatures?" What? No, of course not." "Did you or did you not hold HOA sessions without notifying affected property owners?" That's an administrative oversight." "Is it true you were planning to convert Mr. Crowley's lodge into a political event venue for donor gatherings?" His silence answered for him. Camera shutters clicked like popping ice. Then the twist hit. A dark, unmarked SUV rolled down the road and stopped beside Ruth's convoy. Doors opened. 2 individuals stepped out wearing federal jackets, navy blue, clean, unmistakable. Federal Environmental Enforcement Interagency Authority. One of them approached Sterling. "Mr. Klein," the agent said, voice steady, "we're placing you under federal hold pending investigation into ordinance fraud, attempted misuse of protected waterway resources, and coordinated land acquisition under false authority." Sterling stumbled backward. You can't be serious. This is a county issue." "No, sir," the agent said, snapping a binder open. "Your ordinance language references federal land use clauses. That makes it our issue." The crowd erupted, Cameras rolling, reporters nearly climbing over each other to get closer. Marjorie grabbed Sterling's arm. "Say something! Stop them!" He tried. He failed. As two agents took him gently but firmly by the arms, he began sputtering. "I have influence. I have allies. You can't just take me like this." But his voice cracked into something like desperation. Marjorie shoved through the crowd, only to be intercepted by the second agent. "Mrs. Klein, you'll need to remain available for questioning. We have reason to believe you participated in ordnance dissemination and forged administrative approvals." Her bright fuchsia jacket suddenly looked like a warning flare. This is political sabotage," she shouted. "A smear campaign. Elias Crowley orchestrated all of this. He set us up." Cameras zoomed in on her. A reporter turned to me. "Mr. Crowley, is that true? Did you orchestrate a political takedown?" I met Marjorie's furious gaze with calm, steady eyes. "I didn't orchestrate anything," I said. "I simply told the truth and let the law do its job." Ruth nodded approvingly beside me. The federal agents escorted Sterling up the dock ramp toward their SUV. The boards creaked under their boots. The lake lay behind them like a silent witness. When Sterling passed by me, he paused just long enough for our eyes to meet. "You think you've won?" he whispered. I leaned forward slightly. "I think justice won." His jaw clenched. Then the agents guided him forward, placing him in the back seat. Marjorie stood trembling on the shoreline as flashing lights reflected in the melting snow around her feet. Neighbors turned away from her. Reporters swarmed. The fragile image she'd built shattered like thin ice. The crowd thinned slowly as the county and state teams gathered evidence, logged statements, and photographed the entire setup. Each click of the camera was another nail in the coffin of the Klein's scheme. By the time the last of the media vans pulled out, the sun had begun dipping behind the ridge, casting a golden wash over the lake. Sylvie approached me quietly. "You realized," she said, "this wasn't just about an HOA anymore." I nodded. "No, it was a network, bigger than they let on." "And you cracked it open?" "Not yet," I said softly. "But today started something." The lake rippled gently in the evening breeze, as if releasing a long-held breath, and for the first time in days, so did I. The lake exhaled with me, its surface shifting from tense stillness to a gentle ripple as the evening breeze brushed across it. The golden light that settled over Loon Feather Lake that night felt heavier than usual, like the water itself had witnessed everything and was now easing into a long-awaited calm. The media vans were gone. The federal convoy had disappeared down the winding road an hour earlier. Even the neighbors had drifted home in quiet clusters, murmuring among themselves as they vanished into the pine shadows. The lodge stood still, solid, timeless, almost relieved. I stepped onto the dock, boots thudding against weathered planks I'd sanded by hand last fall. The air, Omar, smelled of wet cedar, snowmelt, and the faint metallic tang of cold lake water. The sun was sinking fast, throwing long amber streaks across the surface. My reflection stared back at me, older, steadier, carrying a new weight, but also something I hadn't felt in a while. Clarity. Footsteps sounded behind me. Sylvie approached with her coat wrapped tight, her hair catching the last streaks of sunlight. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," I corrected. She smiled faintly and handed me a binder, one we'd built together over nights of scanning, documenting, connecting dots. "County investigators already sent updates," she said. "The Klein's operation is unraveling fast. They're pulling files, checking emails, freezing accounts." I flipped through the pages. Each section was another piece of truth laid bare. Forged ordinances, unreported shoreline alterations, false environmental claims, HOA votes that never happened. Every line now had a legal team behind it. "Ruth called earlier," Sylvie added. She said the federal team uncovered connections to 2 other counties. Same tactics, same pattern. I nodded slowly. It wasn't just here. They were scaling it. And you stopped it. I let the binder fall closed against my thigh. Wind stirred the lake, rolling a soft shush against the shoreline. Ruth said something else, Sylvie continued. She wants you to meet with the county board next week. They want your help drafting new protections. Real ones this time. I exhaled a small laugh. I came out here to retire from all that. You don't retire from what you're good at, she said gently. And you're good at protecting places like this. My eyes drifted over the water, tracing the silhouette of the far cove, the ridgeline glowing ember orange in the last light. The lodge behind me creaked as the night chill settled in, wood contracting like the old structure was satisfied after a long day. A truck rumbled into the drive. Sheriff Wyatt Moreno stepped out, his boots crunching over the gravel. He tipped his hat in greeting. "Evening," he said, his breath visible in the frost. "Evening, Sheriff," I replied. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon." He joined us on the dock, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Came to give you an update," he said. "County Council met right after the arrest. They removed Marjorie from the HOA presidency effective immediately, temporary oversight committees being set up, and they're reviewing all ordinances passed in the last 2 years. I let out a slow breath. HOA folks are in shock, he added. Guess they didn't realize their own leaders were working an angle bigger than they could wrap their heads around. He paused, giving me a knowing look. But a few residents told me they're glad it was you standing up. Said if anyone could do it, it'd be the guy who rebuilt his own dock without asking for help. I chuckled. Stubbornness counts for something. Sure does, Wyatt said. Counted today. He lingered for a moment, watching the water, then touched the brim of his hat. You need anything, Elias? You call. This lake's safer with you here. When he left, the quiet returned, the kind that doesn't feel oppressive, but earned. The dock groaned as I sat down at the edge, letting my boots hang over the water. The lake mirrored the emerging stars, tiny points shimmering like needles on glass. The world felt wide and open again. Free of tension. Free of threat. Sylvie settled beside me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. What now? I watched a current ripple outward, soft rings expanding across the otherwise still surface. Now? I repeated. Now the lake goes back to being a lake. And you? She asked. I thought about the council meeting, about the lodge restoration, about the conservation potential this land held. I thought about the Bryersons, the other families robbed by the same scheme, and about the duty that still tugged at something inside me, the part that never really left public service. I'm staying, I said, and I'm building something here, something that lasts. Sylvie nodded, as if she'd expected the answer. The distant call of a loon echoed across the water, a low, mournful sound that somehow felt like a blessing. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine needles and cold stone. The lake shimmered beneath the first stars. Behind us, the lodge waited, warm light glowing from the windows, chimney smoke rising in a soft column through the frosty air. A place of refuge, a place of purpose. Sometimes justice arrives in sirens and signatures, sometimes in quiet acknowledgments, sometimes in the relief of knowing the fight is done. Tonight, it arrived in the sound of the lake settling, soft, steady, peaceful. I stood and looked out one last time at the darkening water. Some people think power sits in an HOA office, I murmured. But out here, real power sits in the land, and the law backing it. The lake didn't answer. It didn't have to. It was enough just to listen. If you've ever had to stand your ground for what's right, drop a yes in the comments so I know you're out there. Justice only works when folks refuse to back down. And if you want to stick around for more real land rights stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. I'll keep the fire going for the next one.